So before I talk about vulnerability, I want to talk about privilege, because I think there's a connection there which hasn't been discussed much. Next week, I will show a video by Brene Brown where she talks about her extensive research on vulnerability, and we will have a discussion about this. I know many of you have already seen the video, but it is worth repeating in order to facilitate our discussion. I think, however, that doing some exploration about privilege will assist us in having a richer discussion. As you know, there are many kinds of privilege, and I who stand before you have the luxury of having most of them. Male, white, heterosexual, cisgender, professional, middle class, partnered, citizen status, able-bodied. There's probably many more that I haven't thought of because of my implicit bias. Much has been written about the various privileges, but I will try to summarize my limited understanding of how this works. I like to think of privilege from two directions. A hardened perspective, which is easy to see, and a softer perspective, which is less visible. The hardened perspective has to do with power. Power and privilege are major dynamics in our lives. Power is never equally distributed. In our interactions with others, the power often shifts back and forth based on what is paramount at that time. Differing power dynamics will always be true. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are taller or shorter than others. Some people know how to repair a car or a roof, and some people do not. Some people know how to write well or crunch numbers better than others. This does not have to be a problem. The reason there is a problem with privilege is that power differentials have become rigidified in our culture. White is seen as better than black, male better than female, heterosexual better than homosexual, bisexual, or asexual, cisgender better than trans or fluid gender, able better than disabled, wealthy better than poor, middle class better than working class, etc. Still, however, even with these rigidities, power can flow back and forth in our relationships because we are all multidimensional people, with some aspects of our identity being privileged and other aspects of our identities being subjugated. I will discuss this further in a moment. First, however, I wish to outline some of the softer, less evident aspects of privilege, at least less evident to those that enjoy that particular privilege. And as I do so, I'm going to use the vowels A, E, I, O, U, each standing for a set of situations. So A stands for access. Those with a particular privilege have more access to resources than those without that privilege. Often people with a certain privilege may say that they believe all people should have access to those resources. So it is a privilege that all people should have, which is true. But it doesn't take away the fact that in the real world, many people do not have that access. A simple example would be the GI Bill after World War II gave access to many white people the ability to buy a home and enter the middle class, like my father did. So a lot of white people were able to buy houses for $10,000 that are now worth $250,000. However, black people were systematically denied access to that resource from the GI Bill. So that was the A. The next is E for ease. Persons with privilege can easily walk through or negotiate situations that become barriers to those without that privilege. It is easy for someone with privilege to not notice that others do not have the luxury of that ease. For example, if you are white, you will not face harassment or ridicule for the color of your skin, nor will you put any energy into preparing for, looking out for, or trying to avoid those situations. There's many more examples that we could give for each of these letters. So that was A, E. Next is I, which is identity. Those with a particular privilege are not generally asked to speak for all people in their group or class. For example, those with white privilege are extremely unlikely to have someone ask them to speak for their race, as in, I was wondering if you could help us all out by sharing how white people are likely to think about this issue. Whereas people of color have that question asked them many times. The next is O, for opportunity. Those with a particular privilege have more opportunities than those without that privilege. And you can probably think of some examples for that. And the last one, U, stands for unconsciousness. This aspect of privilege is evident in all the other aspects listed above. In the midst of privilege, folks do not have to think about or be aware of many things that those without that privilege are forced to be aware of. For example, as a white person, I can wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and not notice that I am white. As a heterosexual person, I can talk about my other gender spouse or partner without having to think about whether I am prepared to out myself to whomever is listening. As a male, I can walk down the street without much thought about whether I might be catcalled or raped. So that's the A-E-I-O-U. I'm hoping that might be useful to remember. Those with privilege, I'm going to get into a little bit about vulnerability now. So those with privilege can be voluntarily vulnerable more easily than those without privilege, because they can always step back and call upon that privilege. Similarly, someone with privilege can, at times, step up to situations of oppression and call upon their privilege to mitigate that oppression. For example, if as a white male, if I witness someone harassing a woman or a person of color, I can place myself in a vulnerable position and challenge the bully. Due to my privileged position, my action could possibly be more effective than if another person of color or another woman were to intervene. This is not always the case, of course. White people who marched with Dr. King were probably as likely to be targeted as black folks. Borrowing from a psychologist by the name of Dr. Kenneth Hardy, an African American who has written about trauma and oppression, he talks about how culture is a broad-based, multi-dimensional concept and influences how we see the world. Gender, race, etc. become organizing principles. These experiences are not neutral in their effects. It is essential to move from a singular dimension of self to a multiple dimensional view of myself or selves. So we have many selves, some privileged and some subjugated. Often our subjugated self hijacks our conversations. I'm going to repeat that. Often our subjugated self hijacks our conversations. In fact, the default self is always the subjugated self. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say I've never been to this church, but as a white male with all these privileges, let's say I'm very hard of hearing, okay? And let's say I come to this church because I heard it was a welcoming congregation and it's available to help people that have different disabilities. So I come into church and I come to the person that's giving out the order of service and I say, I'm glad to be here. My name is Greg. Wanted to let you know I'm hard of hearing. Do you have some little devices I can use to help me hear the sermon? And let's say the person who is giving out the order of service doesn't know. Says, I don't know. Comes back here and they look and they say, well, here's some devices. We can try, you can use this. And I'll say, okay, well, can you show me how to use it? And they say, well, I don't know how to use it. I wasn't trained. So let's say the person that is trying to help me is a person with certain subjugation. Let's say the person is a black woman or transgender person or someone that has much less privilege than I do. At that point, during our conversation, my need, my disabledness takes precedent over that person's subjugation. So it wouldn't be fair for that person to say, well, you're a white male, you should be able to handle this. I have these different problems. Okay, that wouldn't be fair. Kenneth Hardy, one of my teachers, the one I mentioned before, he gave an example. He's a black man, and he was on an airplane, and he was sitting down. He was the first person in his row, and he was very tired from the workshop, and he spread out his stuff, okay? And he was all comfortable, about to eat his sandwich, and a white woman comes up and says, that's my seat next to you. And she got upset with him because it took him a while to clean up his stuff, make space, and so on. So she started in on him and said, you know, I'm tired of all these men that take up all this room, and it's not fair. Well, Dr. Hardy made himself vulnerable during this workshop and explained to the group that he then, when kind of attacked her verbally and said, who are you to talk to me? I'm a black man, you're this white woman with all this privilege and blah, blah, blah. And he said afterward that he was totally wrong about this, because at that moment, his male privilege superseded his black subjugation. And he was wrong. He should have said, I'm sorry, you know, I'll fix it. And he didn't do that. So that's an example of how his subjugated self was the default. It came out, okay? So we have to be aware of what our subjugated selves are as well as what our privileged selves are, and not let our subjugated self come out in a situation where we need to take responsibility for our actions. So other examples in terms of a mixture of privilege and subjugation. In a heterosexual marriage, the man may at times benefit from male privilege in lots of different ways. One example would be that in a social gathering, his comments might be taken more seriously than his wife's comments because he's a male. On the other hand, the woman may make more money than the man, and in financial issues have more privilege and power than the male. So it can shift back and forth. A black male doctor talking to a white male patient will, in spite of the white person's white privilege, enjoy a professional privilege that is manifested in the relationship and that will often overshadow his black subjugation during their interaction, because he has a certain power differential as the doctor. When he is driving home in his Lexus, however, and is stopped by the police for a missing taillight, his DWB status, driving while black, takes center stage, and his professional status floats away in a puff of smoke. The more privilege one has, the more responsibility one has. So in order to facilitate conversation and relationships, one must acknowledge the privileged self that is being called on by the other person who may be speaking from the subjugated self. So when I'm interacting with another person and my privilege is manifest in a way that is potentially harmful to the person I'm interacting with, I can do a few things that can help the situation. And this is again from Dr. Hardy. There's a number of things that the person in privilege needs to do. I'm just going to share 6 of them. Number 1, I can strive to be genuine and authentic. I can talk about consequences, not intentions. When challenged, intentions are irrelevant. I must take responsibility for the consequences of my actions, regardless of my intentions. So in the example before, the person who is trying to help me find a hearing device doesn't need to say, well, our intentions are really good. We really want to welcome everyone. That's irrelevant at the moment. Because at that point, the issue is, can I get this device or not? Okay? Number 2, I need to avoid equalization of suffering, or to presume to understand the suffering of the other person from a position of privilege. The privileged person doesn't have a right to say, well, I understand how hard it is for you, because you don't. Number 3, I can embrace transparency. That is, I can be willing to show myself and be seen for who I am. In other words, embrace vulnerability. Number 4, I can be willing to stretch myself beyond my comfort zone. Number 5, I can strive to be congruent. That is, mean what I say and have my body language, tone, and facial expression match my words. Number 6, I can strive for intimacy by the willingness to be vulnerable. This increases the possibility of intimacy. So if, on the other hand, I'm in a situation where I'm experiencing subjugation, I don't have 6 tasks, I only have 3. And none of them involve being vulnerable. These are the 3 things that is my job, my responsibility if I'm in a subjugated state. Number 1, I need to find my voice. One's voice often goes on mute. Number 2, I need to overcome my obsession to take care of the privileged. One must cease and desist. Number 3, I must try to regulate my rage. In such a situation, of course, one might voluntarily assume a position of vulnerability, like Mahatma Gandhi or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when they were involved in passive resistance. Dr. King and his followers chose voluntarily to become vulnerable to beatings, water hoses, tear gas, etc., without reacting with violence. This was effective because they believed that all humans, even those who were oppressing them, had the potential of love in them, and that the oppressors would, in time, tire of their violence and let go of some of their power. Or even if they were reluctant to do so, an outcry from the larger community would demand it. By demonstrating with their bodies a different kind of power, a power of love or nonviolence, by not giving in to violence, they would eventually prevail, which they did. Another example of voluntary vulnerability would be in the news presently, namely the athletes, mostly black, who have protested police brutality toward people of color. By taking a knee during the national anthem, they have made themselves vulnerable to criticism and possibly losing their jobs. Interestingly, much of the criticism leveled against them had to do with noting that they have the privilege of wealth. I hope my previous comments have stood to clarify the falsity of this argument. When they take the knee, their vulnerability erases their wealth privilege as they honor the involuntary vulnerability of their black brothers and sisters who have died at the hands of police with impunity. Going back in history, they also honor their black sisters and brothers who entered Little Rock Central High School 50 years ago under the protection of federal troops and who still had to withstand being tormented by white students with impunity. To summarize, it is never the task of a person who is in privileged position to expect someone in a subjugated position to voluntarily become vulnerable. Rather, it is the person in the privileged position who needs to do so.